Hello, my name is Jeremy Leyland, and this is my final presentation for World War II Today with Arizona State University. My topic is how post-war justice was implemented in Poland in order to formulate a mythical narrative. Many nations began to have questions about who to prosecute for crimes and what to do with them. In the East, the communists held sway and could dictate policy. Poland's post-war justice was influenced by actions taken and implemented by occupying Germans. Although its post-war justice dictated a narrative that would allow the Poles to establish a victim stance while claiming that they heroically stood alone as a martyr of nations, the victim narrative is hotly contested, as evidence shows the Poles are nearly as complicit and use their judiciary to formulate and solidify their martyrdom. For the Poles, the story of the war has fluctuated over the last 80 years, to include the story of the suffering of the Jews that has been second to that of the Poles. As the Soviets crossed into Poland, a provisional government was established in Lublin in 1944. The Lublin government would begin to issue decrees that would begin to search for individuals who were involved in crimes against the Polish state. A decree issued August 31st, 1944, would be known as the August Decree, and it would go on to influence the majority of the trials regarding criminals and prosecution against the Polish state. What the Polish wished to accomplish with the implementation of this decree was their own legitimization as a sovereign nation within the context of a socialist, legal, theoretical basis that they could use for future criminal law. The decree attempted to classify criminals based on a socioeconomic class. They believed that if criminals had collaborated with the occupying Germans, then there would have been substantial financial gain. Under the Lublin government, supported by the Soviets, convictions would also teach the evils of a capitalist socioeconomic collaborative status. Then, in 1945, the Poles created the Main Commission to investigate German war criminals. Aside from investigating German criminals, it was also charged with extraditing said criminals from Germany to Poland. Polish authorities believed through the 1943 Moscow Declaration that they had the authority to extradite German criminals and prosecute them. The declaration stated that criminals were to be judged on the spot of which the crimes were committed. They also felt they deserved a presence at the ongoing IMT in Nuremberg, but they were only allowed a limited presence. The prosecution was allowed to interrogate witnesses suspected of crimes in Poland and turn these reports into the Soviet judge. Once all of the interrogations were complete, the IMT issued the Polish indictments en masse in December of 1945. Now, when trying suspects for crimes committed against the Polish state, a few things need to be mentioned. First, many of these folks were tried for crimes because of a person's unfamiliarity. What I mean is that if a member of the Gendarme lived in the same town that they were born into, then there was most likely to be an acquittal because there was a level of trust and a level of that familiarity. However, if someone, even if they were Polish, had been relocated from the west to the east, he would be looked on with suspicion. There would most likely be a conviction and a sentence and so on and so forth. And so these people would be seen as less than Polish than his other counterpart who was familiar with the town that he was originally from. Examples of the types of trials are widespread across Poland. Second, the importance of these trials regarding the Polish state. These individuals within the Polish state outweighed those regarding the Holocaust due to the fact that those particular trials had center stage in Nuremberg. The other folks who are in question during this time are the Volksdeutsch. These individuals were Polish citizens before the war. Once the war progressed, they became German citizens as of October 8th, 1939. This is important because all these individuals, all categories 1 through 2, automatically became citizens, while 3 and 4 could be made at a later date. Poles at this time lost their citizenship. They were not allowed to have any kind of state citizenship whatsoever. Jews and Gypsies, were excluded from this grouping altogether, as they had another purpose for those people. The implementation of this list allowed the Polish judiciary after the war to prosecute individuals who were labeled as such. These individuals were labeled as traitors to the nation and potentially responsible for the defeat in 1939. Then a decree would be established in 1944 that would force all the Volksdeutsch into forced labor camps. Further decrees would force them to swear allegiance once again to Poland or be sent to Germany if they failed. All Category 1 Volksdeutsch would be expelled to Germany without hesitation. A number of ideas should also be noted at this time. Firstly, Poland was not completely under communist rule, so their judicial system was still able to freely decide what direction it was going to go. And they had a number of choices. First, they could follow the Soviet show trial scheme because it was effective, and so on and so forth. But they could also follow the West, and they wanted influence from both because they wanted to be a more well-regarded judicial system in the nation-building scheme that Poland was trying to do. The problem is that most of the prosecution, the lawyers, had all been eliminated in the camps, so Poland's legal system was very sparse at this time. Secondly, the commission was not extraditing the criminals for crimes against the Jews. They were extraditing criminals for crimes against the Polish state, per the 1932 Polish Codex. So, for the most part, during this time, Jews had been lumped into the whole, they are also Polish citizens, not just Jews. Now, while Poland was doing its part to prosecute its criminals, they were neglecting crimes against the Holocaust. And the reason is because Poles and Germans agreed that the Jewish population needed to be isolated from everyday life. For the Poles, it was a matter of regaining some sovereignty over their economy, and for the Germans, it was a step in the process of the final solution. So everybody agreed that getting rid of the Jews was beneficial to all parties involved. Even the Polish underground during occupation submitted periodicals that did not sympathize with the plight of the Jews. They viewed the Jews with contempt. This attitude is important because after the war, the Jews spoke out against collaborators. In regards to crimes committed in the camps, when the Jews spoke about them, these cases were usually dismissed to the anonymity and randomness, as victims were scared to talk about their experiences. It was also hard to find suspected perpetrators due to the mass displacement of people across Europe. What is known about Poles helping Jews is that they did, but when it happened, it was rare. And if the Poles were caught helping the Jews, the penalty was death. So the likelihood of the Poles helping the Jews is rare, given the fact that the penalty was death. Quite often, though, Poles would come to the defense of fellow Poles when Jews were accusing them of crimes. So many prosecutors did not want to pursue these types of cases, and because of this, most trials centered around the theme of Polish national suffering and not necessarily about the Holocaust. Due to the direction taken against the narratives that supported war criminals, the communists later on then focused on two things: trying enemies within, enemies against the state, and altering their position during the war. This was evident during the war, the years after 1948, and especially after 1953. What they tried to do was state that Poland had stood together as an ethnic homogeneous state during occupation and that there was no collaborators. After 1953, prosecutions against war criminals dissipated, although 2 more cases, high-profile cases, took place at the end of the 50s. As Poland settled into their post-war years, the education of their youth also fit into their communist narrative. A lot like Russia, they focused on a Polish-centric narrative. They tried to insert more Polishness into their textbooks to focus on the suffering of the Poles as a whole. Until 1989, it was taught that the camps in Poland were a place where Poles were martyred, completely neglecting the importance of the suffering of the Jews. However, few textbooks, even into the 2000s, devote much space to the event and continue to focus on the plight of the Polish nation. Even attempts recently to resist the idea that Poland was complicit in Nazi crimes would come into the form of questionable law. Passed in 2018, Poland's Holocaust law attempts to distort history and punish those who accuse Poland of being complicit in crimes in the Holocaust, echoing efforts from when the communists began to divert attention away from the Holocaust and more towards a Polish-centered narrative. So, after liberation, Poland attempted to reassert itself on a world stage by allowing its judiciary to prosecute individuals who had committed crimes against the Polish state. What this tribunal failed to do was prosecute criminals who had committed crimes against the Jews, meaning that any Pole who had been complicit would most likely have had his crimes either acquitted or just ignored altogether. Because the narrative that Poland was a victim of the war, it became more simple to distort their history and hide any complicity that they may have been accused of. While the Polish judiciary did make valiant attempts to prosecute Nazi war criminals, they would do so only because they had committed crimes against the Polish state. They did not prosecute many Poles who had committed any crimes against the Jews, as that did not fit the political end. They did prosecute Poles that committed crimes against other Poles because it was against the Polish state. To this day, Poland is still conflicted by its past and either accepts their part in the atrocities or they cherry pick the parts that fit conveniently into the heroic resistance or their victim narrative. Thank you for listening to my presentation.